Project MKUltra was a covert research program authorized by the United States Central Intelligence Agency in 1953, formally approved under CIA Director Allen Dulles, and administered primarily through the agency's technical services staff, with day-to-day scientific oversight handled by Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who served as chief of the CIA's chemical division, and according to testimony later presented to the U.S. Senate. The program was designed to explore methods of influencing human behavior in the context of Cold War psychological warfare, at a time when U.S. intelligence officials believed, based on reports from the Korean War and intelligence briefings, that rival nations were allegedly experimenting with mind control, coercive interrogation, and behavioral manipulation, leading the CIA to approve a research framework that was deliberately fragmented into more than 100 numbered sub-projects. In order to limit oversight and obscure centralized responsibility, a structure confirmed during the Church Committee hearings of 1975, where investigators noted that many MKUltra sub-projects were routed through universities, hospitals, prisons, and private research foundations without disclosing CIA sponsorship to researchers or subjects. One of the earliest and most frequently cited cases involving Frank Olson, a Army biochemist working at Fort Detrick, Maryland, who in November 1953 attended a CIA-organized retreat at a cabin in Deep Creek Lake, where, according to later admissions by the agency, Olson and several colleagues were administered lysergic acid diethylamide without their informed consent as part of an MKUltra-related experiment, after which Olson reportedly experienced severe psychological distress, consulted with CIA-affiliated doctors, including Dr. Harold Abramson in New York City, and 9 days later died after falling from a window of the Statler Hotel in Manhattan, an incident initially ruled a suicide. Though decades later the Olson family alleged that key details had been withheld, prompting a 1975 meeting between CIA Director William Colby and the Olson family, during which the agency formally acknowledged the non-consensual drug administration, paid a settlement, and issued an apology, while subsequent investigations, including a 1,994 exhumation, raised further questions without reaching a definitive legal conclusion. And during the same period, other MKUltra sub-projects were allegedly conducted at academic institutions, including the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Montreal, where psychiatrist Dr. Ewen Cameron carried out research funded indirectly through the Human Ecology Fund, an organization later identified by Senate investigators as a CIA front used to conceal agency involvement. And according to patient testimony and surviving records, Cameron's work involved prolonged isolation, repetitive audio messaging referred to as psychic driving, and intensive drug regimens administered to psychiatric patients who had entered the hospital for relatively minor conditions, with funding approvals and progress reports transmitted back to the CIA through intermediaries. And although Cameron later described his work as therapeutic, former patients and investigators alleged that consent was neither informed nor voluntary, leading to lawsuits against the Canadian government decades later, while in the United States, additional sub-projects allegedly took place within prison populations, including experiments conducted at Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia under dermatologist Dr. Albert Kligman, who later stated publicly that he viewed the incarcerated population as a controlled research environment, with funding linked to military and intelligence agencies. And during the 1960 seconds and early 1970 seconds, The CIA continued to renew MKUltra sub-projects through routine administrative mechanisms, including continuation memos and budget justifications that used neutral language such as behavioral research, special interrogation techniques, and human performance, a pattern confirmed when investigators reviewed surviving documents after CIA Director Richard Helms testified that he had ordered the destruction of the majority of MKUltra files in 1973, reportedly to protect sensitive sources and methods, a decision that the Church Committee later concluded had significantly obstructed oversight and accountability, leaving investigators to reconstruct the program from a limited number of surviving financial records, correspondence, and testimony. And although no single document provides a complete narrative of MKUltra, the cumulative public record establishes that the program operated for approximately 2 decades, involved named officials, identifiable institutions, and documented incidents, and concluded not with a formal termination report, but with the quiet disappearance of paperwork, redacted pages, and unanswered questions that remain part of the historical archive, all of which exists now as publicly acknowledged history rather than speculation, recorded in hearings, court cases, and declassified files that end without resolution, explanation, or closure, simply stopping where the surviving record stops. As MKUltra expanded through the late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds, a significant portion of its activity was routed through universities, hospitals, and research centers that already held government contracts. A pattern later identified by investigators as a deliberate strategy to normalize intelligence-sponsored research within existing academic and medical frameworks. And according to testimony gathered by the Church Committee and subsequent Canadian and U.S. inquiries, the Central Intelligence Agency relied heavily on intermediary organizations, most notably the Human Ecology Fund, to distribute money while concealing CIA sponsorship, a mechanism that allowed funds approved by Sidney Gottlieb's technical services staff to reach researchers at institutions such as McGill University, Harvard University, Stanford University, and other unnamed campuses, without explicit disclosure to administrators or subjects. And in Montreal, at the Allen Memorial Institute, psychiatrist Ewan Cameron received funding, beginning in the mid-1950 seconds, for work that he described as innovative psychiatric treatment, but which later investigations characterized as experimental, with former patients alleging that they were admitted for conditions such as postpartum depression or anxiety, and were instead subjected to extended periods of drug-induced sleep, sensory deprivation, electroconvulsive therapy at intensities exceeding standard practice, and repetitive audio messaging played thousands of times, a process Cameron termed psychic driving. And while Cameron later denied awareness of CIA involvement, declassified records showed that his research was funded indirectly by the agency, leading the Canadian government in the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds to settle civil claims brought by former patients, acknowledging harm without assigning criminal liability. And during the same era in the United States, MKUltra-linked research allegedly took place within correctional facilities, most prominently at Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, where dermatologist Albert Kligman conducted experiments involving exposure to chemical agents on incarcerated men, with Kligman later stating publicly that prisons offered a controlled population, and while funding sources included the U.S. Army and private corporations, Investigative reporting and Senate records indicated overlapping interests with intelligence and defense agencies, raising questions about consent and coercion in environments where participation could be tied to privileges or sentence considerations. And beyond universities and prisons, MK-Ultra sub-projects were also conducted at military installations such as Fort Detrick in Maryland, where biological and chemical research units collaborated with the CIA, and where, according to declassified memoranda, experiments involving psychoactive substances were conducted on military personnel and civilian employees, sometimes with limited disclosure, a practice that later drew scrutiny during congressional hearings, particularly when witnesses testified that the culture of secrecy surrounding Cold War research normalized the withholding of full information from subjects. And within the CIA itself, oversight mechanisms were intentionally fragmented, with MK-Ultra divided into more than 100 sub-projects, each tracked separately for accounting purposes, a structure that investigators later concluded reduced the likelihood that any single office could assess cumulative ethical risk. And during Senate testimony, agency officials stated that approvals for continuation were often based on brief progress summaries rather than detailed outcome analyses, meaning that projects could be renewed year after year without comprehensive review. And as the program matured, some sub-projects reportedly shifted focus from overt drug administration to broader PS, ecological and environmental manipulation, including studies on isolation, interrogation, stress, and behavioral conditioning. Topics discussed in internal documents using non-descriptive language, such as human performance or special interrogation, which investigators later interpreted as intentional vagueness. And in parallel, the CIA maintained relationships with political figures and oversight committees that were not fully briefed on MK-Ultra's scope, with former officials later testifying that only a small number of senior leaders, including directors Alan Dulles, John McCone, and later Richard Helms, were aware of the program's full extent. And when questioned during the 1,970 seconds, Helms stated that he had ordered the destruction of MK-Ultra files in 1973 to protect sensitive methods and personnel during a period of intense public scrutiny following the Watergate scandal. A decision that the Church Committee described as having eliminated primary evidence necessary for accountability, forcing investigators to rely on surviving financial ledgers, correspondence, and witness testimony. And while no document explicitly outlines bribery of university officials, Senate investigators noted that funding arrangements through front organizations effectively bypassed normal disclosure requirements, creating what they described as an environment in which ethical review was functionally absent. And in several cases, researchers later stated that they would not have accepted funding had they known of CIA involvement, suggesting that concealment itself was a central operational tactic. And internationally, MK-Ultra-related research extended into allied countries, particularly Canada, where jurisdictional complexity further limited oversight. And according to Canadian parliamentary reviews, U.S. intelligence agencies were able to fund research abroad with minimal interference, relying on institutional trust and academic prestige to shield activities from scrutiny. And by the late 1960 seconds, internal CIA reviews reportedly raised concerns about the scientific value of some sub-projects, though these concerns did not immediately halt funding. And it was only after public revelations in the early 1970 seconds that the program was formally acknowledged and discontinued, leaving behind a patchwork historical record composed of court settlements, congressional testimony, and declassified fragments, all of which point to a system that operated within real institutions, involved identifiable individuals, and employed concealment as a routine administrative practice rather than an exceptional measure. And while definitive conclusions about intent and culpability vary across cases, the documented record establishes that MKUltra relied on secrecy, compartmentalization, and indirect funding to carry out research that, by contemporary standards, would be considered unethical. A conclusion reached not through speculation, but through the cumulative findings of official investigations that continue to shape how this period is understood. As public awareness of MKUltra increased during the late 1960 seconds and early 1970 seconds, scrutiny began to shift from individual experiments to the internal culture and decision-making processes that allowed the program to operate for nearly 2 decades with minimal oversight. And according to testimony later provided to congressional investigators, the Central Intelligence Agency's leadership maintained a structure in which ethical review was secondary to operational secrecy, with senior officials such as Sidney Gottlieb reporting through classified channels that bypassed standard medical or academic review boards, a practice that investigators later concluded was intentional, designed to prevent external interference. And during this period, a growing number of individuals began to come forward with accounts of unexplained psychological trauma, memory loss, and long-term psychiatric harm allegedly linked to experiments conducted under MKUltra subprojects. Though in many cases direct documentation was unavailable due to the destruction of files ordered by Richard Helms in 1973. A decision Helms later defended as necessary to protect intelligence methods, but which the Church Committee characterized as a significant obstruction to accountability, and as hearings progressed in 1975. Senators, including Frank Church and John Tower, questioned CIA officials under oath about non-consensual experimentation, eliciting admissions that some subjects had been administered drugs without their knowledge, a practice confirmed in the case of Frank Olson, and acknowledged more broadly in testimony. By then, CIA Director William Colby, who stated that informed consent procedures had not been standardized during the early years of the program and beyond drug administration, investigators also examined allegations of psychological coercion, including prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, and sensory manipulation. Methods that appeared in both MKUltra documentation and later military interrogation manuals, prompting questions about continuity between experimental research and operational use. Though CIA witnesses consistently denied that MKUltra had produced effective or deployable mind control techniques, a claim that some researchers supported while others disputed. And in parallel with congressional hearings, civil litigation emerged. Most notably lawsuits filed by former patients of Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute, who alleged that they had suffered permanent psychological harm as a result of experiments conducted without informed consent, claims that led to settlements by the Canadian government in the 1980 seconds, acknowledging injury while avoiding formal findings of criminal liability. And in the United States, former inmates of Holmesburg Prison and other facilities also raised allegations of coercion, arguing that participation in experiments had been presented as voluntary despite the inherent power imbalance of incarceration, a concern later echoed by bioethicists reviewing Cold War-era research practices. And as public pressure mounted, President Gerald Ford issued an executive order in 1976 requiring informed consent for human experimentation conducted by intelligence agencies. A policy change widely interpreted as a direct response to MK Ultra revelations, and subsequent administrations reinforced these restrictions, effectively closing the legal space in which such programs had previously operated, though critics noted that the lack of surviving documentation made it difficult to determine the full scope of what had occurred. And within the intelligence community, internal reviews conducted in the late 1972 reportedly concluded that many MK Ultra sub-projects had been scientifically inconclusive, a finding that raised further ethical questions about the justification for the harm allegedly inflicted, and yet despite these conclusions, no criminal prosecutions followed, a fact often cited by commentators as evidence of institutional protection rather than exoneration. And as the years passed, MK Ultra became part of a broader reassessment of Cold War intelligence practices, alongside revelations about domestic surveillance, covert action, and unauthorized experimentation, leading to the establishment of permanent oversight committees in Congress, including the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, tasked with preventing similar abuses, though even these bodies acknowledged limits to their authority when records no longer existed. And in the decades since, historians, journalists, and ethicists have continued to reconstruct MK Ultra's history using surviving documents, oral histories, and court records, producing a narrative that remains incomplete by design, shaped as much by what was destroyed as by what survived. And while the CIA has repeatedly stated that MK Ultra was terminated in 1973, and that no comparable program exists today, the legacy of the project persists in public discourse as a case study in how secrecy, fear, and bureaucratic compartmentalization can enable ethically questionable practices to proceed unchecked. And for many individuals affected, the absence of full records has meant that personal accounts remain partially corroborated, supported by circumstantial evidence rather than definitive proof, leaving their experiences acknowledged but unresolved within the official record. And as investigators noted during the Church Committee hearings, MK Ultra did not end with a final report or comprehensive reckoning, but rather dissolved into silence, its contours inferred from fragments, testimony, and admissions made only after public exposure made continued denial impossible. After the public exposure of Project MK Ultra through congressional hearings, court proceedings, and investigative reporting, what remained was not a complete archive, but a scattered administrative residue. And according to testimony provided during the Church Committee hearings, investigators quickly discovered that the majority of primary MK Ultra records no longer existed, having been destroyed in 1973 under orders issued by then CIA Director Richard Helms, who stated that the destruction was carried out as part of routine records management during a period of institutional uncertainty. Though committee members later noted that the timing coincided with increased scrutiny of intelligence agencies following the Watergate scandal, and as a result, what survived were not comprehensive reports or final evaluations, but fragments, including budget ledgers, continuation requests, routing slips, and correspondence that referenced sub-projects without describing their full scope, a condition that forced investigators to reconstruct events indirectly, often relying on witness testimony that was itself incomplete due to the passage of time, classification restrictions, and claims of memory lapse. And throughout the hearings, repeated phrases appeared in the record. such as, "No further documentation exists. Records were routinely destroyed, and I do not recall," which together formed a pattern that investigators described as systemic rather than accidental. And as committees attempted to trace responsibility, they found that MKUltra's compartmentalized structure meant that although RITI was dispersed across offices, with scientific oversight in the technical services staff, funding approvals routed through financial divisions, and senior awareness limited to a small number of directors, a design that ensured no single office maintained a complete picture of the program. And when records were destroyed, there was no redundant archive from which to recover them, leaving entire sub-projects known only by number and date, their contents inferred from secondary references rather than primary descriptions. And in the years following the hearings, requests under the Freedom of Information Act produced additional fragments. But these were often heavily redacted, with entire paragraphs blacked out, dates removed, and names replaced by blank spaces. A process justified by the agency as necessary to protect sources and methods even decades later. And as historians and journalists reviewed these releases, they noted that many files consisted only of cover sheets, routing stamps, or accounting summaries indicating that funds had been dispersed without explaining how they were used. And in some cases, FOIA releases revealed documents that referred to attachments that were no longer present, suggesting that even partial files had been separated from their original contents. And during later oversight reviews conducted by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, members acknowledged that while reforms had been implemented to prevent similar programs, the inability to examine MKUltra in full limited the lessons that could be drawn as the most controversial element. Each of the program were precisely those for which documentation no longer survived. And as time passed, official narratives settled into a restrained form, stating that MKUltra had been terminated, that improper practices had occurred, and that safeguards were now in place, without revisiting specific cases in detail. And for individuals who alleged harm, this administrative closure offered little resolution, as claims could be acknowledged without being fully substantiated or refuted, leaving many accounts suspended between recognition and uncertainty. And in legal contexts, courts often relied on settlements rather than findings of fact, a practice that resolved claims without establishing comprehensive public records, further contributing to the fragmented historical landscape. And as archival practices continued to evolve, MKUltra became an example frequently cited in discussions of research ethics, classified oversight, and institutional accountability, not because every detail was known, but because so much was not. And within academic literature, the program is often described through absence, with footnotes referencing destroyed files, missing appendices, and testimony that gestures toward activities without confirming them, a style of documentation that stands in contrast to the program's original administrative thoroughness, where funding approvals, travel reimbursements, and supply invoices were meticulously recorded, even as experimental outcomes were not. And this imbalance, noted by investigators, suggested priorities focused on logistics rather than ethical valuation. And as the Cold War receded further into history, MKUltra's remaining traces became increasingly static, preserved in microfilm, scanned PDFs, and archived transcripts that are rarely revisited except by specialists, their language unchanged, their tone flat, their content administrative, And for casual readers, these records offer no narrative arc, no conclusion, and no emotional register. Only statements of fact, followed by silence. And when reviewed sequentially, the documents appear to thin over time, with early years producing dense correspondence and later years yielding fewer and fewer pages until the record effectively stops, not with an order terminating the program, but with the absence of further filings, a disappearance that mirrors the program's original design, which emphasized secrecy, deniability, and compartmentalization. And in this way, the end of MKUltra is consistent with its operation, fading not through accountability, but through administrative quiet. And today, when the program is referenced in official contexts, it is typically described in summary form, its duration, purpose, and termination acknowledged without elaboration, a treatment that reflects both the limits of the surviving record and an institutional preference for closure without detail, and as a result, MKUltra exists in public memory as a collection of confirmed facts, alleged practices, and unresolved questions, none of which are resolved by the archive itself, which offers no final report, no comprehensive audit, and no retrospective evaluation, only what remains after: destruction, redaction, and time. And for those who study it, the program's legacy lies not only in what was done, but in how easily it was erased from formal documentation, demonstrating how bureaucratic processes can both enable and obscure activity, leaving behind a record that ends not with explanation, but with empty folders, missing pages, and the repeated administrative notation that no further information is available. And as the last hearings concluded and oversight mechanisms shifted focus to future compliance, MKUltra receded into the background of Cold War history, its files boxed, scanned, or destroyed, its participants retired or deceased, and its story preserved not as a complete account, but as a pattern of silence punctuated by surviving fragments. A record that does not close but simply stops, leaving the final pages blank, the last entries dated, and the archive quiet, with nothing further added, nothing further clarified, and nothing further recorded beyond what already exists. After the exposure of MKUltra during the 1970 seconds, and the public confirmation that the program had existed for approximately 2 decades, what followed was not a clear reckoning, but a prolonged period of administrative recalibration, during which intelligence agencies, academic institutions, and oversight bodies adjusted language, procedure, and documentation practices in ways that acknowledged past failures indirectly, without reopening individual cases beyond what had already been established through hearings, settlements, and limited disclosures. And according to records from congressional committees and subsequent policy reviews, the emphasis shifted toward preventing recurrence rather than reconstructing the past, a shift that effectively placed MKUltra into a category of closed historical reference rather than an active subject of inquiry. And as this transition occurred, the remaining documentation entered a static phase, preserved as scanned pages, typed memoranda, and transcripts whose content would no longer change, even as interpretations around them continued to evolve. And within these documents, certain patterns became increasingly apparent to researchers, including repetitive administrative phrasing, standardized justifications for continuation or termination, and an absence of evaluative language that might have clarified intent or outcome, a pattern that reflected the program's original operational logic, which prioritized compartmentalization and deniability over synthesis. and when investigators attempted to trace decision-making chains, they frequently embarked at counted circular references, where one office deferred responsibility to another, and another cited classification constraints, resulting in a record that explained how actions were authorized without explaining why they were pursued. And this structural opacity persisted even after the program's termination, shaping how MKUltra would be remembered, not through a single narrative, but through a collection of administrative gestures that suggested motion without direction. And as oversight frameworks matured in the late 20th century, they incorporated safeguards such as informed consent requirements, ethics review boards, and documentation standards, all of which were presented publicly as forward-looking reforms, while internally they functioned as reputational stabilizers, signaling to lawmakers and allied institutions that prior excesses had been contained. And yet these reforms rarely referenced MKUltra explicitly, a choice that some scholars later described as intentional, allowing agencies to absorb lessons without reopening liability. And in academic settings, the program's legacy appeared in ethics curricula and policy discussions as an example of what can occur when secrecy overrides accountability, often summarized in a few sentences that mentioned non-consensual experimentation and Cold War fear, a condensation that made the subject manageable but incomplete. And for those whose experiences intersected with MKUltra-related research, this condensation offered recognition without resolution, as individual accounts continued to exist alongside official stat. It meant that neither confirmed nor denied specific details beyond what had already been acknowledged, creating a parallel record in which testimony and bureaucracy coexisted without reconciliation. And as decades passed, the absence of comprehensive files became increasingly central to how MKUltra was understood, with destroyed records cited not only as an obstacle to investigation, but as evidence of an institutional culture that treated documentation itself as a risk to be managed. And this perspective was reinforced by the discovery that destruction orders had been framed as routine records management, rather than exceptional action, embedding erasure within ordinary administrative process. And when historians examined these practices, they noted that MKUltra did not end through decisive termination or public apology, but through procedural quiet. Its budget lines discontinued, its sub-projects closed individually, and its name removed from active use, while the underlying institutions continued unchanged, carrying forward structural memory without explicit acknowledgement. And within digital archives, this quiet persists, as researchers encounter files that begin abruptly, reference earlier materials that no longer exist, and conclude without summary, leaving interpretation suspended between what is stated and what is missing. And the experience of reading these documents often mirrors the program's operational tempo, slow, repetitive, and non-conclusive, with memos that approve, continue, and defer, but rarely evaluate. And as this pattern repeats across years and offices, it produces a cumulative effect, in which absence becomes the dominant feature, not as a dramatic void, but as a stable condition. And in policy discourse, MKUltra is frequently invoked as a cautionary example, its name serving as shorthand for ethical failure without requiring detailed exposition, a function that both preserves memory and limits inquiry. And as public interest resurfaces periodically through media portrayals, official responses tend to rely on a fixed set of statements, reiterating that the program existed, that it was terminated, and that safeguards are now in place. statements that are accurate but intentionally bounded, offering closure without elaboration. And within this bounded narrative, MKUltra occupies a defined space, neither denied nor fully explored, acknowledged without being reopened. And for archivists, the program remains a challenge, as requests for additional information often yield no new material, reinforcing the conclusion that the surviving record is all that remains. And as time advances, the individuals directly involved recede further into history, their testimonies preserved in transcripts but rarely revisited, while institutions themselves persist, evolving structurally while carrying forward procedural lessons derived from exposure rather than confession. And this dynamic has led some scholars to describe MKUltra as an example of administrative absorption, where a controversial program is neutralized not through resolution but through normalization, its existence folded into the broader history of Cold War intelligence practice, sees as a reference point rather than an ongoing concern. And in this normalized state, the program's remaining traces are catalogued, indexed, and preserved in their incomplete form, forming an archive that does not invite further action, only review. And when that review occurs, it is often characterized by repetition, the same names, dates, and phrases appearing across secondary accounts, reinforcing a stable narrative that changes little over time. And as the language around MKUltra stabilizes, it becomes increasingly procedural, with discussions focusing on oversight mechanisms, consent frameworks, and archival practice rather than individual experience, a shift that reflects both ethical progress and the limitations imposed by missing records. And within this context, silence functions as content, with the absence of detail shaping understanding as much as the presence of fact. And as readers move through the surviving materials, they encounter a rhythm of acknowledgement followed by omission, statements followed by redactions, and conclusions followed by administrative closure, a rhythm that ultimately defines the program's public afterlife. And as policy documents and educational materials continue to reference MKUltra, they do so with restraint, emphasizing lessons learned rather than actions taken, a framing that reduces emotional charge and supports institutional continuity. And yet, for those examining the archive closely, the persistence of gaps remains striking, with entire sub-projects known only by number, duration, and funding amount, their content inferred RA, than described. And this inferential quality has become a defining feature of MKUltra scholarship, shaping how the program is discussed, taught, and remembered. And as digital preservation efforts continue, the existing documents are unlikely to be supplemented, as agencies have stated that no additional files remain, rendering the archive effectively closed. And within this closed archive, time appears suspended, with documents from different decades coexisting without narrative linkage, their meanings derived from juxtaposition rather than sequence. And as the final entries are reviewed, they do not culminate in a conclusion, but simply stop, reflecting the manner in which the program itself faded from administrative view. And in this fading, MKUltra becomes less an event than a condition, illustrating how secrecy, bureaucracy, and fear can interact to produce actions that are later acknowledged without being fully explained. And as this understanding settles into institutional memory, the program's legacy persists quietly, not as an unresolved investigation, but as a completed administrative chapter whose contents are partially missing, partially known, and no longer subject to expansion. And in this state, MK Ultra rests within the archive, unchanged, its pages scanned, its margins preserved, its silences intact, offering no final report, no comprehensive audit, and no definitive account, only what remains after destruction, redaction, and time. And as the archive continues to exist in this form, nothing further is added, nothing further clarified, and nothing further recorded beyond what already exists, leaving the record as it is, static and quiet, with the last dates fixed, the final pages incomplete, and the program's public life concluding not with resolution, but with administrative stillness, where inquiry slows, repetition settles, and attention gradually fades, allowing the subject to recede into the background of history, present, acknowledged, and silent.